I think we're
Gotcha.
going to see even more dramatic rent increases.
Really?
Yeah, because again, like so much of rent is about landlords' expectations, right? Like they look around and
Mm.
see what everyone else can charge. And now Airbnb is really at a point where it's factored in, right? Like
Oh,
because renters are
yeah.
not going to be really competing with other renters, they're competing with short-term renters, and they pay a lot more money.
That was my guest for this episode, Dr. Mehmet Cansoy. Dr. Cansoy is an economic sociologist. He actually looks at the evolution of these platforms like Airbnb over time, how we went from being sold kind of this model that this is going to allow everybody to put their properties online and have equal access and an equal opportunity to make a little bit of extra money, to where we have it now, where we have just a handful of people owning kind of the majority of properties. And this idea of actually living in the property and renting out the property that you live in is almost a relic of the past at this point. We had known that there could be some problems with Airbnb when it first came out, but it took us a long time to really be able to see what some of those symptoms are, see things. And now you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who hasn't seen kind of a negative impact of Airbnb in their community. So I had simply asked Dr. Cansoy, what is the next thing that we might see? So we're already seeing Airbnbs kind of move in. We've seen the gentrification process happen. We've seen safety issues. We've seen kind of destruction of community safety nets, things like that. So I asked him, what are maybe some of the things you see coming up in the future that those of us who don't study this every day aren't necessarily seeing in our radar? And so that, unfortunately, was his response is if we don't start to put some measures in place that curtail some of the growth and the hold that Airbnb has on some of these communities, this is what we're going to start to see across the country, of just rents going up because of the ability for would-be landlords to make so much money by putting them on as short-term rentals rather than rental properties. So they'll raise that rent to match that. And if a renter can't come in and afford it, that's fine, because they can still make that amount of money in short-term rentals. So when we're talking about times when we have housing crisis and housing shortage going on, that's really kind of a bleak outlook that he gave. But as with any of these episodes, this episode included, there are tips, there are strategies, there are people out there doing things to kind of make sure that not every place that offers short-term rentals has to go this route. So hopefully you learn as much as I did in this conversation. Hopefully it opens your eyes a bit to what's going on, but also gives you hope for things that we can do in the future. So again, here's my episode with Dr. Cansoy talking about the commercialization of Airbnb. Enjoy. All right. Welcome to the You're a Tourist podcast, where we get very serious and share a laugh or two about all the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of tourism that you may or may not have ever even thought about. I'm your host, Dr. Katie Dudley, and my guest today is an assistant professor of sociology at Fairfield University. His work focuses on the relationship between technological change and inequality, especially in the platform economy. His work has appeared in Socioeconomic Review, Theory and Society, and American Behavioral Scientist. Welcome to the show, Dr. Mehmet Cansoy.
Thank you, Katie. It's a pleasure to be on with you and to be talking to your audience.
All right. Well, yes, thank you for coming on and talking, because we are going to be diving into some very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff that I'll admit I don't know that much about. So I'm just going to be a little question factory myself as we go through this. Okay. So really what we're doing is kind of focusing on short-term rentals for this whole season. And we're diving into, again, every angle, the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of short-term rentals. But before we dive into kind of your most recent work, and we're really going to dissect this latest article that you've published, but let's take a step back and just for kind of the general public, what do you mean when you say you're looking at the relationship between technological change, and inequality?
So I'm an economic sociologist, so we study the types of questions economists have traditionally shied away from. So 10 years ago, when I first got into this field, there was a lot of excitement around platforms, right? Like they were new, they were the new shiny toys, they were getting tens of billions of dollars of investment in. But
yeah,
the amount of work on what they actually did in the real world outside of like theoretical models of them were fairly like rare. So when I first got in, I went in with the kind of traditional sociological questions, right? Like sociology, if you've ever taken an intro course, we do race, class, and gender, right? Like those are some of our core issues. So I went in and said, okay, people seem to be making decent money on Airbnb. Can we figure out who they are, right? Like who makes this money? Where does this extra economic activity flow? So my initial work was on like, okay, let's look at the neighborhood level, like within cities, what types of neighborhoods get more Airbnb dollars versus what other types of neighborhoods. So that was part of my dissertation work. It turns out middle income, but like proportionally much more heavily white areas of cities get more Airbnb dollars. Areas where residents are much better educated, have more educational attainment, get more Airbnb dollars, and areas that are traditionally more marginalized don't. That's not very surprising. Especially again, if you imagine like 10 years ago, like Airbnb itself was 5 years old, 6 years old at that point, like small amounts of activity, and it was flowing into neighborhoods that were already hip and happening. But a few years down the line, I went into another phase of my work where I was trying to figure out what's happening in these marginal areas where there is some activity, right? Like it's not like there's no activity there. And a paper, a chapter of my dissertation that's turning into a paper soon, where we used facial recognition to identify who these hosts are.
I almost remember this. When it came out.
There have been a couple of people that have done similar stuff like this. Like, who are these hosts in these marginalized areas? And it turns out they tend to be like in their 30s, present to be much more white than the surrounding areas. So the people that make money, even in the marginalized communities, don't present marginalized identities. So that's kind of the idea I look into. So we have a technological innovation, a disruption. Airbnb comes in and makes what used to be vacation rentals available everywhere to everyone. And I study, okay, what happens to pre-existing social patterns, right? Like inequality in the city, what's going on with this new innovation. That's kind of what I study.
Oh, yeah, because that's what we see. I'm like, which question do I want to take from this? Because your mind's just your question's making my mind go crazy. So for one, Airbnb comes out on the scene of this like social sharing. It allows everyone, the everyman, to make a little money. And then as the consumer, it's like, and if you choose an Airbnb, then you're helping your fellow man.
Absolutely. That was a marketing campaign they made.
Yeah. And it's like, but we're finding out that it's just like, no, it's still the same. It's not solving anything. And if anything, it deepened kind of some of those things. Yeah.
So just to say what you said again, like one of their primary marketing campaigns this was back in 2016, 17. Like,
Okay.
it was a way for people to afford to live in the city, right? Like, you would rent out your spare bedroom and you could pay your rent.
Right. Yeah.
Again, echoes of our housing crisis there, if you can catch them.
Exactly.
But it turns out, like, well, people are not stupid. If landlords realize, well, if you can rent out your spare bedroom, well, now your rent is your regular rent plus the rent of your spare bedroom on Airbnb. So
Wow.
doesn't seem to be fixing any of the problems. Definitely not.
No. And that's I have these questions are kind of fresh in my mind for another group that I'm going to have that is a resident group. And that is, they're here in California, and that's what you hear from the hosts a lot is this idea of, well, I do it so that I don't get evicted, so that I can pay my mortgage, so that I can keep my house. And so it's like you feel for them on that side, but it's just like, what a loop that we're stuck in.
Absolutely.
Right?
Like it's been a complete transformation of what urban real estate is, right? Like American real estate is already heavily financialized. It's an investment tool as much as it's shelter and accommodations. But short-term rentals, the platformization of short-term rentals, I should try to be clear about that, really changes that calculus. I think I'll try to give you a rough number, so don't take the number as like gospel. But when I was doing some research on New York City and in LA, numbers were fairly similar. A short-term rental unit that was full-time short-term rental, right, like year-round, stood to earn something around 3 to 5 times the average rent in its neighbor. Like, that's a game changer, right? Like, everyone has to play that game now.
Right. Yeah. And if you don't have the capital up front to be able to buy that, then you're out of the game.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Then you're like the rest of us, just fighting for crappy rentals that you're paying way too much for.
Yeah, and that we're not good enough for anyone to convert to short-term rent.
I guess that's true. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, it's like, you're like, well, I don't think I can get the money off short-term rentals, but these schmucks that have no other option.
Absolutely.
I can suck all their money. Living in LA. Isn't it great? Isn't it great, folks? Okay, so we're going to dive into all of that a little bit more as we talk about it. So let me just introduce here, kind of tee up. So the article that really stood out to me that made me reach out to you came out in 2024. It's an American behavioral scientist, and it's called Commercialization on Sharing Platforms, the Case of Airbnb Hosting. In this project, you analyzed how Airbnb markets in the 10 largest short-term rental markets in the U.S. changed between 2015 and 2019. And you say this provided the first comprehensive account of commercialization of a major platform. So we're going to, again, start at the beginning. What do you mean by commercialization of a platform?
Yeah, let's start there. So as we just talked about, when Airbnb first came out, again, I think it's founded in 2008, if I remember correctly, maybe 2009. It had all this air of like amateurism, right? Like Brian Chesky and his co-founders blew up an air mattress and rented that out. Like, that's the myth of the company.
Yeah.
But what we're finding in this paper is that type of participation in the platform, right? Like that type of blowing up an air mattress and renting that out, giving someone your couch to sleep in for the weekend, is increasingly not a part of the platform, or not a meaningful part of the platform. What we keep finding is these commercial operators. So commercial operators in this sense being properties that are for rent pretty much year-round, properties that are professionally managed, sometimes by outside firms, sometimes by third-party people, right? Like not the owners or the people living in it, but like actual property managers. that are
Mm.
cleaned professionally. There's turn down service professionally. Laundry is done, like all of that stuff. So
Yeah,
they're
it's a
basically
hotel.
hotel rooms.
Yeah.
So, but in this paper specifically, we're not measuring that side of it, the turn down service and all that. We're just looking at, okay, what's going on in terms of which properties are exclusively Airbnb properties. They're not housing units.
Okay, so that's what we mean by commercialization. Okay, so again, so because we see this, because again, like we talk about so many places, whether we're talking US, whether we're talking throughout the world, we're seeing a lot. We're
Yeah.
seeing what has happened to the communities. We're seeing, but more importantly, we're seeing residents kind of rise up. They're rising up against tourists, all of that kind of stuff to be like, we need to essentially put the genie back in the bottle. Like
Yeah.
this has gotten out of control and it is impacting everything. So we do see a lot and hear a lot of arguments for the pro side of it, of still back in this, like you say, 2008 days of, but it's just somebody trying to help pay their mortgage. It's just somebody
Yeah.
helping getting by. And so that's what you're kind of looking at and studying, is that whether or not it ever was the real case. But more importantly, with that is not what we're seeing today. It's a commercial. It's not a sharing platform. It's just a straight commercial business, essentially.
Absolutely. And again,
Yeah.
like that doesn't mean people are not paying mortgages, but those mortgages are on units they bought to put on Airbnb, right? Like they're no longer,
Right.
this is my apartment, but I can't afford the $4,000 a month mortgage on it, so I'm going to rent it out on the weekends. I bought this commercial property. It's an investment. I rent it out full time on Airbnb.
Yeah. And and maybe this goes beyond the scope of your research, but you have to have come across it because you've been studying it for so long. Because that's what when we talk kind of about how it's been used as a gentrification tool.
Yeah.
So that's just it. So now you talk about this other paper in your dissertation that's coming out of who's doing it, and it seems like we've seen examples in a lot of places where it is low income neighborhoods that maybe are on the periphery of tourism
Yeah.
areas, like right outside the French Quarter in New Orleans, places like that, where kind of your low income or even the workers that work there. And now you've got people coming in and paying more than they could ever imagine just so that they could have that prime property.
Absolutely.
So,
Again, I live near New York, so New York is where I know it
yeah.
the best. And I used to live in Boston, so I know that quite well too. You're describing it exactly right? Like areas that were maybe not the best residential areas, but had decent like connections to downtown where the touristic stuff is, that are getting taken over. And again, these are traditionally areas that have been prone to gentrification before too. So it's not, for some of them, it's not the first time. For others, it's not unexpected. But it seems to have been a particularly powerful and like well-financed attempt at gentrification, definitely.
Yeah. Well financed, and kind of we all looked the other way because of this, this for
It was
one, the
exciting.
marketing. Yeah, it was exciting. You got to stay in places so close to places. And then I look at things, from a tourist perspective, tourism perspective. And that's just it is, as we've seen people and trends change and people have turned away from mass tourism and they don't want to be a tourist anymore. So they're like, oh, I stay in neighborhoods. I go and I experience like the real. And it's like, well, you kind of do because you're living in someone else. You're
A place
dealing with
someone else could have lived in. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, somebody used to live right here, and now I'm just in here partying until 4 a.m. Okay, so we've touched on this a little bit. What you talk about of the accommodations and Airbnbs and again, having people go in and buy things, buy up the property, and you have to have that. So what is that kind of the major thing? What makes platforms like Airbnb and VRBO, when we're talking about kind of the platform economy, the gig economy, how does it make them different from like rideshare or food delivery apps?
Well, they're different in a couple of ways. I mean, first
Okay.
of all, and this is kicking Uber while it's down, I guess, but Airbnb is actually profitable.
Oh.
And again,
Shots
like,
fired.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I assume VRBO is too. Like, seems like they're profitable. I haven't looked into their
Mm.
quarterly statements in a while, so but Airbnb definitely is. So,
Okay.
and part of that is, well, they're selling a higher value product, right? Like they're not trying to make their
Mm.
money $10 a ride at a time. You're booking multiple $100, multiple $1,000 at a time, and Airbnb can make a healthier
Yeah.
profit off of that. The second part of this is on ride hailing or food delivery and all that stuff. What's primarily on sale is people's labor, right? Like, so Uber has to maintain
Oh,
a really large workforce, right? Like drivers that are
gotcha.
active or that can become active really quickly. So they have to pay enough for them. And even though they've dialed back what they're paying, there's been a lot of problems with it.
Yeah.
But Uber is more expensive to run, basically, right? Like you have to have
Gotcha.
labor wherever you're on the ground. And you have to have customer support and all that, which we know Airbnb is not great
Yeah.
at. I'm sure you'll talk to
Yeah.
some people about that. But on short-term rentals, what's on sale in the platform is capital, right? Like in terms of like, even if it's like someone who's renting that's giving you the apartment, their access to that like valuable apartment is their capital. So they're not
Mm.
selling you their ability to like clean a bedroom really nicely. It's valuable. It's not worth that much. What they're selling you is, oh, I have this $500,000 apartment that you can stay in for a couple of days. And that means, again, like there's all those like possibility of making money is kind of incomparable. If you buy a
Mm.
car and drive for Uber 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, you make $1,000, you make $1,500. That's kind of where drivers were as when we were talking to them.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
on Airbnb, on a popular weekend, you can make that in a weekend, if not more. And the amount of
Sure.
labor involved is half an hour of messaging someone and 2 hours of cleaning the apartment. So that's
Exact.
why we have such a dramatic impact on Airbnb, right? Like there's so much more money to be made.
Yeah. So when we're talking about stuff like that, it makes sense why it's such a challenge to get Airbnb to care, to get the
Yeah,
host to care, because it is, I mean, that's what I've been seeing looking around is it's in a lot of these places, it's the host groups will form an organization and they're the ones stopping the regulation,
regulations.
which, oh my gosh, it just all lined up because then it's like, because then when we think of who the hosts are and they're the ones who already have the power and the money. And so they're, oh my,
Yeah,
it's a cycle.
but it's not even as innocent as that, right? Like it's not just
Oh
people coming
no.
together to protect themselves. Airbnb consciously organized those host groups. When we were interviewing
Uh,
people, I want to say 2016, 2017, in
mhm.
the like areas around Boston when there was some talk of regulation going on in the city. But Boston, if you know it, is like pockmarked with small municipalities all over. It's not like one big municipal authority. Uh,
Gotcha.
Airbnb organized groups across the whole geography, right? Like for hosts to lobby their local governments. So
Okay.
it's not even like people coming together on their own interest. It's Airbnb organizing. I mean, they're not necessarily astroturf, like there is actual organization going on. Hosts are actually interested in this. But
Yeah.
without the support of Airbnb, we probably wouldn't have seen it as effectively.
Oh, and then it's, yeah, because, and when we go back to this idea of how it's different from, from the ride share, like you say, it, again, it's the money
Yeah.
And that's what it's like when I saw around here in LA when Uber was putting all of that money into trying to stop regulations. It actually had a lot of the drivers on its
On
side
the
and
side,
everything
yeah.
kind of, yeah, probably doing the same strategy as Airbnb. And then, but it's because the people are the ones putting in so much labor and not making money off of it. Now they're turning on Uber and was like, hey, we helped you. And now
Yeah.
you've screwed us. Um, okay. So it's starting to make sense in my mind of just like Airbnb. Yeah. It's like the people that Airbnb are organizing, they have incentive. They have less work
A
and more
lot of
money.
it.
Yeah. So, okay. Okay. All right. So we'll just keep moving right along because we haven't even got to
Oh, yeah.
any of the
Sorry, I've been
findings.
talking a lot.
Oh, no, this is great. This is great. We are going deep into Airbnb, folks. Um, okay. So, I have this question here. We have touched on it,
Hmm.
but I just want to straightforward. When we have this, that in the early days, they embraced this idealist discourse and the person to person and
Hmm.
everything else. Having studied this for so long, do you think that was ever really part of it? Or do you think what we're actually doing is studying a very successful marketing strategy that was started in 2008?
I mean, there is no debating it was very successful, right? Like here we
Yeah,
are 16, 17 years later, still talking about it as the sharing economy, the sharing platforms.
that's
But
true.
I think there was some part of it that was true. Now, there have been a lot of like academic critics of even the branding of it, right? Like people said, this is not real sharing. We shouldn't let them uh,
Mm,
like uh, take over the word like that. But
okay.
when we were actually interviewing people who were renting their apartments on Airbnb, again, 16, 17, 18, we interviewed a whole bunch of them. Uh, we were seeing some marginally commercial activity, right? Like people were renting out their spare bedroom 1 day, 2 days a week. People were renting out their apartment, literally packing up on like Thursday, giving Friday, Saturday, Sunday to the guests and coming back on Monday. Sometimes
Okay.
even like, and they had like different ways of operating here, like different motivations. Someone, like one person we talked to was trying to save up for a wedding. Other people
Oh,
were one person had just lost their job, like again the repercussions of the Great Recession, like they were employed in a
yeah.
sector that kind of stopped being a sector. So
Oh,
he was trying to
yeah.
like things back together, and this was a way to like just pay rent for a while. So that was real, right? Like
Mm,
we ran into enough of these people to say, okay, yeah, there is this,
mm-hmm.
but even that's not real sharing, right? Like that's a way of extracting rent out of your real estate. And
Yeah.
it did help a lot of people. A lot of the people we talked to were not like evil gentrifiers coming in and destroying neighborhoods.
Right.
But I think that's become less and less of a thing. We haven't like done qualitative work on this in a while, so we haven't gone out and talked to people. But
Mm,
in our quantitative work, which we'll talk more about, like it turns out that type of like, let me do 1 day a week, let me do like whenever I'm saving up for a vacation, I'll do it twice a week or something, and then when
mm.
I have the money, I'll stop. That seems to have become incredibly like unimportant for Airbnb.
Gotcha. Yeah, and just the competition to have. Like if you're just gonna
Yeah,
put it up every like, oh, in June I'm gone for 2 days, and so I'll put it up one time a year, then it's like that's on page 6.
exactly. It's never, no one's ever gonna see it anymore.
No, I don't go beyond page 2. So that kind of takes us into this. So you're already kind of touching on it from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned in this article that the literature is often like the current research out there. And again, like we talk about, I mean, people have been looking at this from all different kinds of fields and disciplines for a very long time. But the majority of that research, if not all of it, kind of look at it as this static platform, as
Yeah.
this thing that was handed to the world in 2008. And that's how I'm going to look at it. And I'm going to see all these different things. But that's what you focus on. You focus on the change and the transformation. So why is that important? What does looking at the transformation start to tell us?
So part of the reason, like why it's so important is, like you said, like if we imagine platforms to be these like perfectly conceived innovations that never ever change, we miss a lot of what's going on, right? Like Airbnb in 2008 is not the Airbnb we have today, not just in terms of like the design is sleeker and all that stuff, but they've added a lot of stuff in, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
customer reviews, the star system, the dynamic pricing tool, letting people figure out how much to charge. Like, so the market itself has shifted, how Airbnb operates, but also, as we argue in this paper, what people do on the market shifts. So partially in response to what Airbnb is innovating. And this is not like a dramatic argument we make. Like people have talked about how platforms are these like malleable, adaptable things. They're not just like one singular thing. Like people have talked about how Uber in Sweden is different than Uber in LA, right? Like in Sweden, everyone's an employee. They get retirement benefits and all that stuff. Not in LA, right?
No.
Or in New York, they have the Drivers Guild, right? Like because New York kind of forced them to do something, and Uber convinced regulators to do this halfway thing. So that's why it's really important to figure out, okay, we recognize these things are these malleable, adaptable things. Well, let's figure out what's happening in them instead of just saying that and moving on. So that's why I think change is important to study.
Yeah. And that's what you mentioned at some point too, where it's like, just when you say, you know, Uber's different and from one country to another and everything else. And it's almost like that is part of a strategy of Airbnb because it is so multifaceted and everything else that it almost becomes confusing.
Absolutely.
You're like, where do I start?
Because like it has to deal with a bunch of different regulatory agencies, right? Like the federal government doesn't ask it to do much, but states sometimes have taxes, like Washington State has like state level taxes, but also municipalities do their own things. Sometimes it operates across like special tax districts and all that stuff. So it has to negotiate a really complex geography of like authority, let's say. So it has to respond to that by trying to fine tune what it's doing, right? Like if Seattle says you can only rent properties for like 60 nights of the year, and Washington State says you have to charge 5% state tax on top of everything else, you have to make sure that property in Seattle, Washington fits both those, checks both those boxes. So it gets really complex and hard to understand.
Yeah. And it doesn't, I mean, I'm not trying to just attack Airbnb, but I'm not trying to say that you're great. But it also seems like, and this is working for them, that they're not going to be proactive. When a place sets regulations, Airbnb's not like, okay, well, guys, get it together. Austin just put regulations in, so we got to change everything. They're like, we're going to wait till somebody comes to us. Yeah.
They'll wait for a lawsuit, 2, maybe 3, until they change things. I mean, it's like part of it is the regulations have primarily targeted like property owners, right? Like, so the especially in the earlier years, the onus of like abiding by the regulation wasn't on Airbnb. So New York City said no short-term rentals ever, but it didn't say Airbnb, you can't advertise short-term rentals. So people just said, well, whatever New York says, I'll still put it on Airbnb and make all the money I can until New York identifies which out of the hundreds of thousands of housing units this specific one is. and has to
Exactly.
prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that's the case, right? Like that's a really tough
Yeah.
order for municipalities. So Airbnb
Yeah.
was very happy to play in that world. But that's changed. I think we can talk about it a little later.
Okay. Because, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I was seeing that here. So I actually live in Long Beach, which is right outside of LA. And I saw
Yeah.
this for the first time that, yeah, if a neighborhood wants to petition to say, like, a certain percentage of a neighborhood does not want Airbnbs in this neighborhood. Apparently, it's like $1,000. I think the number is like $1,058 to even start the
Bring it.
process
Yeah.
of saying, yeah. So if you're a neighbor or if you're a group of neighbors and you're just like, we don't want this here, you've got to start with paying $1,000 just to say, I don't want this here. And then you have to get, and then I forget the percentage, but a very high percentage of
Of
signatures and
signatures.
everything
Yeah.
else. Yeah. Like it is a process to just be like, hey, I'm in this quiet, sleepy neighborhood. I bought it for this reason.
Mm-hmm.
And now I don't want Airbnbs in there or short-term rentals.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so let's dive in. So,
Mm-hmm.
so when we say Airbnb data from the 10 largest metro area markets, I'll just run through them, but I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. We've got New York, LA, Chicago, DC, Miami, San Francisco, San Diego, Austin, Seattle, and Boston. So that's where. So what we're going to talk about first is the data, because it's not like you could
Mm-hmm.
go, and maybe you did this a little bit, but I was going to say it's not like you could really. There's such big markets with such a big short-term rental footprint that it's not like you could just go into each city and just look at that and pull their data one by one. So you use this AirDNA data, but so here it is. So again, when I say that I do things from tourism, and we hear all the time, it's amazing how much data is available whenever we're talking about the economic impact or the jobs creation of tourism. I mean, every single week, we're going to see those headlines everywhere of all the
Yeah.
great things that tourism did. But what I've found is if I'm trying to find data that's any other subject or looking critically at something, the last one that mine was actually looking at sharks. I was trying to find whether or not having a shark presence in the media and things like that is starting to impact tourism economies.
Mm-hmm.
And just trying to get that was just like, no, well, actually, we don't keep that data. We keep a state level. And then it's like, but we only do it monthly, but we only do it from the year and we do it a year back. And it's just like, good.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that for such a behemoth industry that gets touted for doing so much good, it's so hard to get data. And so it's like, you've either got to pay an arm and a leg for it, or you've got to piecemeal and just hope. So,
Kind of
so tell
squint and
us
hope that there's a story there.
exactly. And then when you do tell it, be like, I hope that this was actually representative data. I don't know. So what is this AirDNA? Because I know that, because again, I mean, when I started going to tourism conferences back probably 2012, it has always been a topic. How do we get the Airbnb data? And and no matter what, because a lot of the people that were at these conferences, they were wanting it for economic benefit reasons. But yeah, so it's just like, how do we get it? So that's kind of been a known secret that Airbnb will not give up their data easily.
Yeah.
So what is AirDNA? What was your experience?
So again, initially when we started work on this, we had some contacts in Airbnb and they strung us along for a few months saying we might give you some data, that might happen. It did not happen, right? Like, and again, that's not very surprising. That's kind of the core of their business. They don't have much else, right? Like that's what they're selling.
That's true.
Over the years, we've tried a couple of different approaches. So as a sociology grad student, I learned how to code and scrape data from the Airbnb website. They do their best to make that very difficult, but it's doable. But like you said, this project was a really big one. Like I think like we cover every single day of 5 years, and that covers something like, off the top of my head, something around like 400,000 properties, because some churn in and out, like some join and leave and all that. So that was a lot of data. So we went to the commercial like data scraper. AirDNA is a commercial company. They do professionally scrape Airbnb every day for every property.
Okay.
And because we're doing an academic project, we got a really nice discount from them, and
good.
used our
That's what I
funds
was
to
like.
buy their data.
Yeah.
Still was expensive, but not as expensive
Yeah.
as if we were trying to do something commercial with.
Yeah. Okay. So what you did, so I listed all the markets that we looked at. And so then from 2015 to 2019, like you say, you just collected data for those 400,000 properties just every single day.
Yeah.
And it was, what was it? The availability, the
Yeah.
rented.
Were they available?
Mm.
Were they blocked? And if they were blocked, AirDNA has a machine learning algorithm that predicts whether that day was reserved, like someone actually booked the property, or whether it was
Okay.
just not available that day.
Gotcha.
And the price at which it was listed, so how much would it have cost to rent that property that day, and a bunch of other things. But I think those are the critical ones for us.
Okay. So then you took all of that and you categorized the properties from on a spectrum from very casual to very frequently rented. So like, just give us an idea, what would very casual look like
Yeah.
versus the other end?
So the very casual are people who are just marginally doing this, right? Like, so people who listed their property as available for rent less than 30 days in the previous year,
Okay.
or they booked it, like actually rented it out less than 12 days of the year, of the previous year. So, and then we kind of stepped it up for each of the categories. So casual properties, they were listed more than a month, more than 30 days, but less than 120 days. And they were booked for between 30 and 60 days. So
Gotcha.
4 months listed, 2 months of that booked roughly. And then frequently rented, we had people who had listed their properties up to 8 months. So they were available for rent almost 8 months of the year. And they had been booked between 60 and 120 days. And then very frequently rented, the tip top of the best Airbnbers there. Basically, they listed at least 8 months, at least 240 days, and booked at least 120 days. So booked at least 4 months of the year.
Gotcha.
The idea behind this is, as you go up from like very casual to very frequently rented, like at the top, you have units that cannot be available for regular people to live in, right? Like for long-term rent. Because if it's available 8 months of the year and it's booked at least half of that, well, that's not an actual rental property, right? Like that's hotel room.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's just it too. Is so if you're living next to that person, or next to that house, because clearly you're not living next to a person. Yeah. So that means for, 4 months out of the year, it's just a rotating door next to you. And people on vacation, which notoriously do what they want.
Exactly. And honestly, I can say I looked at the data a little bit before we talked. A lot of these are just year-round, right? Like, so I mentioned you where we capped them, but some of them are like 8 months is just the lower limit. Some of them are just 365 days a year.
Yeah. And just not even hiding it. They're just like, this is a hotel.
Exactly.
So when you did that and you categorized them, so what'd you find? Like, where were the numbers? The most,
so
the least?
The numbers are actually, it turns out, let me just pull them up so I'm not talking. So the numbers are fairly similar, right? Like, so when we look at early on, like roughly like a quarter of, so 25% of the properties in each of those categories. So it's not
Okay.
like there are no casual properties. It's not like there are no very casual properties. But it
Mm-hmm.
turns out those very casual properties are really not making money, right? Something
Gotcha.
around 65, 70% of all money made on Airbnb goes to those very frequently rented properties. So Airbnb still
Gotcha.
has like a large diversity of properties on it if you're willing to look for them. But as you suggested
Mm-hmm.
earlier, the casual ones are on page 6. No one sees them, no one goes.
Yeah. That's yeah. That just makes me think it's like, the person in the neighborhood who's just like the neighbors. It's like I have this thing, and anytime my friends or family come to town, I can say, "Oh, I'll shoot them over to your Airbnb."
Exactly,
Like,
right? Like,
yeah, that's the only way that's getting rented.
yeah, and it's that's a very infrequent thing to have.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we've got so that's
Mhm.
an interesting and an important note to make there. So you have a variety. And so again, this kind of goes into, everything's all about marketing. And so yeah, from a marketing standpoint of like, yeah, this is what we do. Look at all the different varieties, look at the different people that we
Yeah,
help, look at all of this stuff. But then it's like when you look at the money, it's like, but 65% of the profit goes to the very frequent, goes to the top. Yeah.
yeah. And again, like some of that is just has to be true, right? Like if you're renting it out 365 days a year, you are going to make more money than someone who's renting it 10 days a year. But that
Yeah.
also tells you like Airbnb makes it its money, right? Like its share of fees, profits,
That makes
whatever,
sense.
from the very frequently rented properties. You renting it
Gotcha.
out 10 days a week is not going to be enough for Airbnb. It won't make a profit that way.
That's going to shoot it back down to Uber standards. It
Yeah.
can't live like that once it's tasted the high life. It's going to make sure that those very frequent ones, yeah.
Yeah, that
Uh,
they stay in business, that they are highlighted, they get enough money that people keep their properties at that level, so that
oh,
Airbnb itself makes them it's cut off the profits.
yeah. Oh my gosh. And we see this, yeah. I do a lot of work on the tourism workforce. And
Mm-hmm.
it made me really think of that too, because again, it's all about narratives and it's all about, and that's always, uh, what I get a lot of is somehow it's still the narrative that people who perform tourism jobs, tourism work, are high school kids having a summer job. And it's just like, yeah, maybe 10%.
Yeah,
But even that, I don't know if it's the same because the world has changed and high school kids don't have summer jobs anymore. But it's like, but 65% of them are the ones actually in the tourism worker case are the ones who need the help, who need the higher wages, who need all of this. But we like to talk about, oh, it's okay. They can make minimum wage because it's just a high school kid putting
yeah,
themselves through college because we all know a summer job will put you through college right now.
yeah, absolutely.
Look at all the different fields we're just tearing down. Look at us. Okay, so let's see. Um, okay. So let's dive into the really interesting stuff. So many
Mm-hmm.
towns, we know this, we talked about this kind of at the top. Um, so we've gotten to the point, and again, I do think there's a lot of people that are, um, that have a lot of things to say about the residents kind of rising up against tourism or the tourists and rising up against the stuff. But frankly, they are sick of it. It's not going to correct itself. So the big thing that everybody's doing right now to kind of push is that we need regulations. We need tighter regulations. We need tighter all of this. So that's what you all did too. You actually looked at some of these. Well, I think you looked at all of the places, and in the paper, for the sake of space, you really dove into 3 places. But you looked at these places that had implemented regulations to see if these regulations were actually being effective once they went in. So just kind of walk us through some of your findings when you looked at that.
In the paper, we look at 3 places. So Seattle, Washington, which I mentioned earlier, is one of them. Austin, Texas is another. And now I'm blanking on the last one, of course.
San Francisco.
San Francisco is the big one, of course. Like that's where it's the
that's
home
the
of
home
Airbnb.
base.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these places have tried a bunch of different regulatory like attempts, right? Like, so they've tried, San Francisco initially tried outright banning the practice, didn't quite work out. Airbnb was able to organize against it, like with its host, as we talked about earlier. Like that's where it really birthed that idea of, if we do this type of organizing, it works.
Okay.
But like Washington State tried taxing it, as we talked about. Austin in the past tried, like you mentioned with LA, like trying to cap how much of each neighborhood could be converted to short-term rental unit, like full-time year-round short rental units.
Okay.
But as we say in the paper, none of these have seemed to make a big impact, right? Like, at least in terms of commercializing it, right? Like,
gotcha, yeah.
In all of these markets, and again, we looked at, like you said, all 10 markets, we see the same trend, right? Like, doesn't seem to matter what type of regulation you pass, doesn't seem to matter like what registration requirements you put into place, what caps on how many days a year you can rent put in place. Seems like across all of that, Airbnb tends to get commercialized a lot. Now, one thing that seems to have worked, and this happened pretty much like right after we submitted this paper for publication, New York essentially shifted this regulatory approach. Remember when I said, like, if you put the onus on the homeowners, it's hard to police. So New York said, Airbnb, you can't advertise illegal short-term rentals anymore. So now the onus was on Airbnb. It had to make sure that every property it listed was registered. And then New York basically stopped giving out registration approval to anyone, which basically kind of killed large swaths of Airbnb rentals in New York City. That seems to have worked. Other cities around the world have tried the same approach. Like Berlin in Germany banned Airbnbs. Amsterdam did some. Theirs is more complicated, but they basically essentially banned some of them downtown. Barcelona has been trying different ways of doing it. So there's been a bunch of that, and that seems to have at least initially accomplished some of what it was trying to do. Now, maybe we'll talk about this in a little bit more about whether that's the most desirable outcome, but that seems to be working. Like if you say no short-term rentals ever, and Airbnb will punish you if you keep advertising them, that seems to be working. But that might be a little more draconian than ideal.
Well, some of the impacts that we're seeing on these places, though, it is almost like I feel like we've pushed ourselves into a corner and have to, because it's just a wild animal that is just out there destroying stuff, and it's just like it's not gonna right itself.
Yeah, like figuring out how to regulate it short of an outright ban seems to be really hard too. I fully understand that.
Yeah, because also, and it's one of those things too, where it's like, because when we look at your categories, if I was reading this right, so what you found in these places is whenever some of the regulations went in, the actual people who felt it were the casuals, below. Yeah. So the very frequently rented and the frequently rented stayed. And so those are kind of our commercial, our every single day, so they stayed, and it actually impacted the people who would be doing it just a little bit. So it's like the regulations aren't necessarily stopping the issues, but what they are doing is making it even less and less and less accessible for just the everyday man to take part in it.
That's definitely true, right? Like, because if you say you have to acquire a $1,000 license out of City Hall to operate it, well, if you're only renting 10 days a year, that's never going to be worth your time.
No, yeah.
Or if you have to carry insurance, I think this was a place in Europe that said you have to carry commercial insurance. And I think some homeowners insurances in the US mandate that too now, if you're doing this.
Okay.
Well, again, if you're just doing it casually, the initial cost of getting that is never going to justify keeping the practice.
No.
So that's why we keep seeing like regulation increases the cost of doing business, and the people who are just barely doing it drop out.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily, I won't say in the medium and long term, that might actually be a way to limit Airbnb, because what we keep seeing is there's a lot of churn, right? Like the same properties don't stay on forever, right? Like, so once you convert an apartment to an Airbnb, it doesn't stay an Airbnb forever. We're not quite sure why that's happening. Some of it we suspect is the nature of the data, right? Like you list your property, Katie, and then you make enough money and say, okay, I'm going to give this to a property manager now because there's enough profit that I don't need to deal with this anymore. So you take off yours and the property manager puts it on under a different name. So that could be what's happening. But we also see what looks like actual churn, right? Like people make money, they come off, they sell the apartment, someone else doesn't want to deal with Airbnb, they actually want to live there. So if you limit entry a little bit, right? Like if you stop people from dipping their toes in it, you might be able to reduce some of this unchecked growth of Airbnbs and short-term rentals. But again, that's going to be a limited thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think a big takeaway from a lot of that is there's a lot of anger,
so much.
Yeah. There's anger, there's confusion, there's desperation, there's all of this stuff, and nobody necessarily knows where to put it. And so because what we see, again, with people with the tourists, and we saw people with water guns and everything else going after the tourists. But then we also see with Airbnb, people will graffiti the house and, put stuff out there and say, no Airbnbs here. We don't want you, all of that. And so it's just like, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz. It's like Airbnb is just the man behind the curtain and nobody knows how to get mad at them. And so everyone's getting mad at everyone else. And it's like, it's really hard for like cities even seemingly to figure out of like what is the right path.
Absolutely. And if you'd asked me 5-6 years ago, I would have said, well, before, again, New York finally just said,
that's enough.
The law is the law. Airbnb, you can't break it.
Yeah.
Initially, what I supported was something along the lines of like forcing Airbnb to share data, right? Like, so that cities could figure out, okay, these are where the properties are. This is how much money is made. This is how many nights they're booked. Like that would have enabled the kind of nimble regulation. But Airbnb has fought this now for like tooth and nail 10 years, like so many lawsuits across the world, right? Like they do not share their data with regulators. So that's why we ended up with the really harsh bans on it. But I still believe that might be the way to do it, right? Like if we get to a point where data sharing is a matter of course, like that's the cost of doing business for Airbnb.
Yeah.
And courts back municipalities. That's, of course, the critical part here.
Yeah.
Then you might be able to regulate, right? Like if municipalities can say, oh, you've already done 10 nights this month, you can't do anymore. Or you've already made $20,000 in the past year, you can't keep doing it, right? Like that would enable much more nimble policymaking rather than harsher ones.
Absolutely. Because I think that's it, right now, again, I'm not like on the inside of any cities trying to do this, but it's like right now they're coming across as money hungry grubbing, but like you say, it's like it's either no, absolutely not, and when it comes down to it, it's this company refusing to share their data, because we could make responsible regulations if we had the data. Wherein I would like to think, again, I don't work in city government, but I would like to think at its core, they do care about the residents and they do want to maintain and be an actual city with actual people who live there, rather than just a transient of people coming and going. But it's so hard to make an informed decision if you don't have the data. And we know
Absolutely.
that city governments are strapped for cash. They can't hire someone to come in and do the data and everything on their own. So it's really like, it is such a strategy by Airbnb to just hold that data so close, because once they let go of it, people could actually start making kind of smart decisions based on it.
Yeah. And in its absence, we only are left with these like really heavy-handed bans and all that stuff because, well, nothing short of them work. That's
exactly. So again, and it's like Airbnb's just sitting over there with a tub of popcorn, just raking in the money and watching everybody fight over it. And they're just like, what are you going to do?
So I think they're hurting a little bit, right? Like if you lose New York City, that's a lot to lose.
Yeah.
But even then, like, not to sidetrack us too much, but because of the way municipal power works, you lose New York City, and what happens is, well, people move across the Hudson, and like Newark becomes the new hub of Airbnbs because Newark and New Jersey don't have the regulations.
Yeah.
So we're getting like one more level of, I guess you would call it like becoming more and more peripheral, right? Like, the city center has municipal power, Newark doesn't, so they get all the
exactly. And that would happen in LA. It would happen in Chicago, in the suburbs, and all of that. Austin, of course. Yeah. So that would be hard too, because that's what my brain went to when you said New York banned it. I was like, well, maybe if all of like the big heavy hitters put in these big things to ban it, maybe that would make Airbnb kind of stand up and pay attention. But you're right. We could create even bigger problems that then people have to clean up for years to come on that side of it.
So, like any other urban policy issue, it's a really hard one to pick apart.
Right. It's not an easy decision. Okay. So I've got two more kind of final questions to kind of tie all of this up. So for one, like we say, when now just kind of the general public, and we've hit the tipping point where everybody can see kind of some of the issues and the impacts of short-term rentals. But people who have studied this stuff, like you've been seeing the signs of this to come for years and years and years. So right now, where we sit right now, is there anything that's kind of popping up in y'all's radar that, like, you guys think this is bad? Wait, what's coming in 5, 10, or 15 years if, like, we don't turn the ship around? Do you see anything kind of bubbling?
I mean, the crystal ball is a little murky, but there are a couple of things, right? The first one is, especially where regulation hasn't been happening, right? Like, we've just talked about this limits and all that, but it has worked a little bit in some places. I think we're going to see even more dramatic rent increases.
Really?
Yeah, because again, like, so much of rent is about landlords' expectations, right? Like, they look around and see what everyone else can charge. And now Airbnb is really at a point where it's factored in, right? Like, because renters are not going to be really competing with other renters. They're competing with short-term renters, and they pay a lot more money.
Okay.
Especially because, like, now every major city has professional services around it, so that you don't have to clean your apartment. You don't have to manage guests. You don't have to do the key handover. You just say, okay, take 5%, do all this. Here's an apartment.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're going to see a lot in like unregulated markets. In more regulated markets, I think we're at a point, as we just said, like Airbnb is hurting enough that it might be willing to give and play ball a little bit more, right? Like,
Okay.
so, but we also will see a lot of like what we call the gray market around short-term rentals. Uh, again, Europe has a lot more to do with this, but in Berlin, for example, they put the ban together, like Airbnb is completely banned downtown Berlin. And what we keep seeing is lots of people that were short-term rentals advertise on a bunch of different platforms, but they don't exchange money on them, right? So they work more like yellow pages, not yellow pages, like classifieds. You look at it, but then you go and exchange money like in person so that the transactions are not recorded and all that stuff. So there are a lot of illegal rentals like that. I think Airbnbs in Turkey have kind of switched to this because countrywide they were banned a few months ago, and that's what's been happening there. This is harder in the US, right? Like there isn't as big a gray economy. People aren't as comfortable with like exchanging cash for these types of services. But I can imagine this becoming a bigger issue. Again, because the earnings potential you're blocking people from accessing is so much that there will be some of this. So figuring out how to do the smart regulation instead of pushing people into these illegal activities and all that might be the way to go. Now, the most pessimistic thing I have is a few years ago, I was in Florence, which, as you know, like downtown Florence in Italy is a tiny, tiny city, incredibly old, like amazing buildings. When we're talking about like Airbnb with scholars there, it turns out those types of places are kind of becoming Disneyfied, right? Like the sense of eerie feeling you get in like main town USA, where this looks like a town, but it's not a.
Yeah.
Because if there are, I think downtown Florence has something like 3,000 housing units, maybe 4,000, like in the old city.
Yeah.
When we were talking with them, I want to say this was early 2020, right before the pandemic. They were saying on like in some months and peak months, there would be something like 2,000 units on Airbnb.
Oh my
So
gosh.
almost half the city, right? Like at that point, there's no community left, right? Like you don't have neighborhood stores. You don't have small restaurants where locals go. You don't have anything other than tourism.
Yeah.
But without the level of control that Disney has over maintenance.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that takes us back to this, what I was talking about at the very beginning of the idea of the tourist bubble getting bigger and bigger. And it's like tourists, you can go out there and you can say that like, oh, I'm not a tourist. I just experienced it like a local. And it's like, except for you don't want to experience all the grime and the dirt and the everything else that is a city that makes an urban core. And so those areas are cleaned up for you by people.
Absolutely.
And we Disneyify them. And we put a craft brewery next to a cute coffee shop, next to a dog shop and all that. And so we do that for you. And we want you to stay there because we can also keep you safe
fences
there.
Around.
Yeah. So the farther and farther you kind of force a city to grow that bubble and go into the neighborhoods, then the whole city becomes that. And it's just a shell of what it was. It's a shell of the character that even brought tourism to begin with. I'm looking at you, Austin, Texas. But it's just, because we give you the tourist version of real life in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And every apartment has the same furniture from IKEA. Every restaurant sells the same 5 foods, and people feel like they're living like locals.
Exactly. They're like, oh, this is what it's like to live in LA. It's like, oh, good, it's not. That is not. Go take a shift on Uber. Then you'll be like every other person in LA. Uber, all of the apps actually. Yeah, and then those illegal ones, that is scary for cities. Like, and that's
Yeah.
something that cities need to think about, because you're like, you lose your money at that point, because when they're exchanging, and I've had people say that to me in the past on various different platforms, say, okay,
Yeah.
next time, here's my number and you can
Let's
just
just do
call
it in
me.
person. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's like, well, then the city's losing out on those taxes and everything
Mm-hmm.
else. And it really is just this house taking up room in a neighborhood. And
Yeah.
so it's like, that should be alarming for places. And places like
I mean, it's,
LA and New York will survive, but it's
oh,
like some
yeah.
of these smaller and mid-sized cities that are doubling down. It's like, don't get yourself in that spot. And then I'm just bashing on all cities, because I almost said, and then you'll end up like Detroit. Sorry, Detroit, you're great, but you don't got a lot of
Well, I
money.
don't think they have a particular Airbnb problem, at least.
Yeah, I don't think short-term rentals destroyed Detroit. I'm no expert. Okay, so one thing that we do know from all of this talk, we know that any reports on the death of the sharing economy have been premature. The
To say the
sharing
least.
economy, or the thing that goes by the sharing economy,
Mm-hmm.
is here to stay, and definitely commercialization is at the central core of
Yeah.
Airbnb. Um, so what, like, just as a tourist, as someone, because again, we know there's a lot of neighborhoods and things organizing and things, but if I'm a tourist and I'm trying to figure out and decipher all of this stuff, what's a step that I can take to just like not be part of the problem, to do my little step?
Well, that's really hard, right? Like, stuff we've
Mhm.
been talking about are these structural problems with cities and Airbnb and like the platform itself and type of tourism it enables. And
Yeah.
I feel like personally, people shouldn't necessarily feel bad about Airbnb that much
Mm.
because, like, if we don't shift the structure, individual decisions are going to be really hard to change around this. And there's some like
Yeah.
actual like reasons people like to travel with Airbnb to have short-term rentals, right? Like, so for example, my son has fairly pervasive food allergies. We need a
Mm.
kitchen when we travel, right? So,
Oh, yeah.
and not everywhere has extended stay hotels and all that stuff. And even some of those hotels don't have enough of a kitchen to justify
Yeah.
staying at them. So, uh, like there's that. There's also a clearly established demand for this type of stuff, right? Like where people like rent a big house and have a family vacation. That's
Hmm.
really hard to do in a hotel. So
Yeah.
there's the consumer demand for it. So the thing to do is, well, first of all, figuring out if you can organize locally. I know, again, we talked
Mm.
about Austin a bunch. Austin actually has a lot of active organizers trying to
Oh,
advocate against like short-term rentals in their communities.
that makes sense. Yeah.
So
Sorry, Austin.
there's that. Well, the thing to rag on them is, well, the state level regulations have been a joke.
Yeah.
So that there's like that type of thing individuals can do, right? Like becoming a part of these organizations. The second thing to do is, well, maybe go on page 6 and see if any of those are worth a shot, right? Like if you because
There.
if you are actually renting out property we would have called like casual, very casual, the damage
Hmm.
is much more limited, right? Like if you're renting out like a room in someone's house, the
Hmm.
damage that short-term rentals can do to communities is much more limited that way. But again, that's not like it's not what people want out of the platform. So I'm really
That's
hesitant to
true.
say that's the solution because it very clearly isn't. So it's the structural level where the solutions should be found. Individual level is really hard.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and that's good. And uh I like that you're honest about that, because it is, if you are a family of set a family reunion, or, you know, grandma and grandpa are coming and the kids and stuff. It's very hard to just say like, oh, get 7 hotel rooms then with no kitchen and no place to
And
get
everyone's
out
on a
and do an
separate
activity.
floor and no way to
Yeah.
communicate with each other. Like, that's really hard.
Yeah. And so we don't have to feel bad about that, because it's kind of like the boycotts that a lot of people will do, like, you know, on a fast food chain or something. It's like at the end of the day, it doesn't do that much to the bottom line.
Yeah.
So at a local level, kind of put your efforts more toward reining in Airbnb, reining in the structural side of it.
Yeah. Go
Yeah.
to a council meeting and talk about it. That's much
Yeah.
better than figuring out which particular Airbnb is the least harmful.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, and that's good, because then it lets people still use Airbnbs because they're so convenient.
Yeah. And they're great.
Maybe that's it. Maybe hotels. Oh, that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to shake this world up.
Yeah.
We're going to say, hotels, you need to start changing your room layout. There. That sounds
nice.
cheap and efficient.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to get the Hotel Association on my side on that one.
Though they did laugh at Airbnb for a few too many years, and now their lunch is getting eaten. So maybe they will act up. Who knows?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we want to feel bad for the hotels, but you're right. They didn't take them seriously for a little too long.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cansoy, for joining us, for, again, pulling back the curtain, telling us a little bit more of this mysterious thing that lives in all of our neighborhoods, called Airbnb or VRBO or whatever it may happen to be. If any of the listeners want to learn a little bit more about the work you do or anything, do you have a website or anything they can check out?
They can check out my website at Fairfield University. They can reach me on pretty much any social media platform you can imagine. My name is fairly unique, so I'm very searchable. You can just search my name and you'll find me.
Ah, there we go. And I would say, and you could read his articles, but, you know, if you want to talk about commercialization, it's really hard.
Oh, yeah.
But I bet if you reach out and ask, he'd be happy to share.
I have preprints I'm happy to share.
There we go. All right. And so for everyone else, for all things tourism, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at You're a Tourist. And remember, you can call yourself whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you're a tourist, and it's okay. The first step to getting better is admitting it. All right.